Well, good morning, everyone, and good afternoon and good evening, depending on where you're in the world. Welcome to the first webinar of the Powering Past Coal Alliance's webinar series. My name is Binu Jakumar, and I will be your moderator today. I'm with the Pembina Institute. We're a Canadian think tank working on policy solutions for climate action and resilient economies. Along with E3G, we are co-hosting the Secretariat to the Powering Past Coal Alliance. The PPCA, as many of you may know, is a coalition of governments and businesses working together to phase out unabated coal power generation. And these webinars will serve as a platform to explore practical solutions towards that goal. Incidentally, our first meeting actually coincides with the IEA's release of the World Energy Outlook. So I thought we can't quite ignore that. There's some really interesting headlines coming out of that. And one of which for the electricity sector is that solar PV is set to take the mantle from old king coal. Solar PV is already cheaper than coal and gas in many of the largest electricity jurisdictions. But we're finding that even with these challenging economics, many coal plants are continuing to operate and pose one of the most serious threats to averting climate change. In fact, the IEA in its report states that if today's coal plants, along with other infrastructure, continue to operate the way they are, we are for sure going to exceed the 1.5 degree target. And that brings us to today's webinar. Our question today is, how do we then retire coal plants early? Over the next hour, we'll look at some financial mechanisms that can enable us to retire coal plants early. We'll start with some opening remarks from the governments of Canada and Denmark, followed by a presentation from the Rocky Mountain Institute, then a panel discussion with experts, and finally, closing remarks from the UK government. A few technicalities before we start. If you have any questions during the session or have any comments or suggestions for the PPCA, please type into the Q&A tab. You will see it at the bottom of your screen. We'll be collecting questions throughout the event, and we'll address some of them towards the end. The webinar is being recorded, and both the recording and the presentation will be made available on the PPCA website. We also encourage you to tweet about this webinar. Please use our Twitter handle @PastCoal, and we can retweet you. Okay, so without further ado, I now invite to the screen Francis Pigeon, Director of Climate Finance and Partnerships at the Government of Canada, which is one of the co-leads for the Alliance. Mr. Pigeon.
Thanks, Binu, for the introduction, and thanks for this. Obviously, I'm very happy to be here today on behalf of the PPCA co-chairs to launch this webinar series. Like we all know that phasing out emissions from coal-fired power is the essential first step that we need to take in fighting climate change and to meet our temperature goals under the Paris Agreement. It was through 3 years ago when Canada and the UK co-founded the PPCA, and it remains true today in the face of the COVID-19 pandemic. Over the last 3 years, the Alliance has made significant progress. So as most of you know, we're now joined by over 110 national and subnational government, businesses, and organizations that are all committed to accelerating the transition away from traditional coal-fired power. We have formed partnerships with incredible organizations, just like the Rocky Mountain Institute. So I'm very happy to see Paul today joining us on this first webinar. We've published finance principles to actively engage with financial actors. And the PPCA has been featured as the world's foremost climate and energy events, including COPs, the UN Climate Action Summit, and the 2020 Investor Summit on Climate Risk. In 2019 alone, coal power generation saw its largest decrease in history. This year, we witnessed the largest cancellations of coal projects in a 6-month period ever as a result of the pandemic. This is obviously certainly cause for celebration, but we still have a long way to go. Earlier this year, the PPCA co-chairs, so Minister Johnson Wilkinson and Kwasi Kwarteng, set out 3 critical priorities for the PPCA in the lead up to COP. First, to build a vibrant and diverse membership. To deepen our engagement with coal-intensive economies, and particularly in the global south. And last, to aggressively phasing out international coal finance. The webinar series that we're launching today is really a key element of that first priority. We're building a stronger alliance by sharing the collective expertise and knowledge of PPC members and partners. Throughout this series, we want to engage diverse practitioners in key topics relevant to the challenges and opportunities in coal phase out and highlight the efforts and achievements of our members. The topic of this very first webinar today cuts across two other priorities: exploring the challenges that coal-dependent economies face in phasing out coal assets, but also practical solutions and financing approaches that bring together public and private flows to speed retirement and support a just transition. So I'm very pleased to welcome you all officially to this PPCA webinar series. It's great to see such an impressive turnout. We were just talking before starting this conversation that this is maybe the most popular PPC event that we've seen to date, especially in a virtual format. And I really encourage you to engage today through the Q&A function that Binu mentioned, as well as beyond this first session. We want to, because we're looking to you, our members, our partners, interested group, for your ideas, challenges, solutions, lessons, and best practices to really make these webinars as rich and vibrant as the Alliance itself. So thanks again for being here, and let's get started. Binu, over to you.
Thank you, Francis, for your opening remarks. Really encouraging, like rallying the troops here. So in addition to the Canadian government, the Danish government has also been a very active member of the Alliance. And we're honored here to have Thomas Anker Christensen, who is Denmark's climate ambassador. And I invite him to the screen to share his remarks as well.
Thank you, Binu, and thank you, Francis, for your leadership. Without you and the UK taking on this course, we wouldn't be where we are. And also thank you to the PPCA Secretariat, but also to the folks who wrote the report, because that is really an extremely useful argument and business case for all of us who are working on the case of coal phase out. And let me just, stress what's in the report says, that coal is no longer the cheapest power source for the global economy. And you mentioned that, Binu, also from the IEA. This is the key message we need to shout from every corner globally as we move towards rallying for COP26. The phase out of coal should be one of the top priorities for international climate diplomacy. And I think even UN Secretary General Guterres has made it one of his top priorities, both to rally for phasing out coal, ending new coal investments, and stopping investments into coal technology and export of coal technology. So we have a champion to rally around, the SG, but also I think a number of conditions that are moving in our direction. Let me just mention a few. The EU with its Green Deal is now on a roll to phase out coal. I think the EU Commissioner for Energy even has an interview in today's Financial Times where she stresses this, so that's really encouraging. Then we do have the prices of renewable energy that keep coming down. We have the private actors who Francis alerted to that are adding to the global divestment trend and are moving in this direction. And of course, there is a public mobilization that really is also pushing in this direction. I think creating the perfect storm for accelerating coal phase out. So let me just, and then finally, we shouldn't underestimate what's happening in COVID-19 territory in terms of economic recovery. Many countries are investing in black, but also many are looking at the green space and how to actually turn around their economies. Just three issues I wanted to raise. How we have, what our experience in raising ambition in Denmark is, the need to stress the business case for early retirement and for coal phase out, and then our need as a PPCA community to intensify our collective strategizing and action towards Glasgow. For Denmark, we started out as a fossil dependent country like everyone else 50 years ago. And we've made a rapid transition, especially in the last 20 to 30 years. We had more than 90% coal in our energy mix 20 years ago. Today we have 2 power plants left, and we're at between 70 and 80% renewable energy, primarily through wind. We expect our last coal power plant to be shut the latest in 2028. It's been a long, hard slug, but I think we have the experience now on how to do it, and in our energy cooperation bilaterally with some of the largest emitters, we are trying to pass on that experience to build the capacity and to also build the knowledge on how to go to scale in renewables and integrate it into your grid. It's something many countries are skeptic about. I've myself been in conversations with energy experts in places like Korea, Japan, even China, and you really need to make the argument sort of peer-to-peer, and we can see that it works. Second, to come to the report, a key barrier to accelerating the phase-out is that a vast majority of coal plants are insulated from competition from renewables by long-term contracts and uncompetitive tariffs, and I'm sure Paul will speak more to that, and that is a key challenge for us as we approach these sectors. So we need to be more coordinated to unlock this by aligning the key stakeholders. And the approach mentioned in the report on refinancing to save customers money, reinvesting in clean energy, and supporting a just transition for workers makes a lot of sense to us. So we hope we can deploy this multi-stringed approach as we work with these countries to build ambition and to, in a way, rally ambition towards Glasgow. Third, our joint efforts. It's clear that as we rally ambition, we need to address decision makers to get them on board. And this can be done towards COP26, which is really a perfect platform for alignment. But I have to stress, we as climate diplomats and partners in dialogue, we need to ensure on a plant-by-plant, asset-by-asset basis that we have the right data and projections and that we have the same approach as we engage governments and operators. We need to be precise and accurate to have legitimacy and credibility, and to be able to present precise policy measures that might convince decision makers, investors, and plant owners. And as the report shows, we have that solid business case. There is no need to oversell the development of market and green technologies, but we can, as PPCA members, engage even more actively in dialogue with these coal economies in Asia and elsewhere. So we do think we have a solid basis now for moving forward as a one common front as PPCA members. We have been actively engaged in doing that in places like Korea and Japan, but I think we can deploy more broadly now as we move towards ambitious NDCs and setting clear goals for decarbonization. So thank you, PPCA, and thank you, Paul and team, for the efforts and for giving us the ammunition that we needed to move forward. Thanks.
Thank you, Thomas, for sharing Denmark's journey from coal to clean, as well as your more recent efforts on peer-to-peer engagement. That's the sort of sharing of best practices we all also want to encourage with these webinars. So thank you for being an excellent role model. So with that great context, I think we're ready to dive in and learn about some of these financial tools for early coal retirement. So to present them, I invite Mr. Paul Bodnar, who is the Managing Director at the Rocky Mountain Institute. Paul?
Thank you, Binu. Thank you to the PPCA co-chairs, and thank you especially as well to Thomas. Certainly Canada and Denmark have shown the rest of the world what is possible in very different circumstances to accelerate coal phase out and hasten the advent of the clean energy economy. And it's an honor to be invited to present at the very first PPCA webinar in this series. So for 10 years, the center of public attention on coal has really been on trying to avoid the build out of new coal. And that's been the center of public campaigns. It was the center of the drive to try to end public financing for new coal-fired power plants. But as we'll talk about today, as we continue that journey, and we also need to shift our focus as well to how we're going to accelerate the phase out and replacement of the existing coal-fired power fleet. Rocky Mountain Institute, in collaboration with the Carbon Tracker Initiative and the Sierra Club, conducted just a few months ago a novel analysis of nearly 2,500 coal plants around the world to understand the very latest financials and to inform some recommendations that we'll be walking through today. We knew that new coal is already uncompetitive with new clean energy in most places. However, the competitiveness of renewables has accelerated so rapidly in recent years that we wanted to ask the killer question, which is, under what circumstances is it now cheaper to build new renewables plus storage than to continue operating existing coal-fired power plants? And that was the query that we ran in the analytic aspect of this project. So I will walk you quickly through three main aspects of this report, How to Retire Early. First, I'll run through the data-backed conclusions from the report for all the main regions and what they tell us about the competitiveness of the existing global coal fleet. Second, I'll discuss how finance and incentive-based financial approaches can help us accelerate coal phase-outs. And finally, I'll touch on who should take the lead in driving this forward. So if you go to the next slide, please. So why do we need to focus on the existing fleet? Well, it's pretty simple. To avoid climate catastrophe, global coal use must decrease by 80% below 2010 levels by 2030. This was already a sort of finding coming out of the IPCC 1.5 degrees report. And just yesterday, as noted, the IEA's New World Energy Outlook had a similar conclusion about the percentage of the global coal fleet that must be out by 2030. And as the PPCA has enshrined in its own declaration or charter, I can't remember what it's called, this means rapid coal phase out in OECD countries during the course of this decade and in the entire world shortly thereafter, by around 2040. I believe the PPCA declaration may have a different date. But the point is we need to do this quickly, and we need to do it faster than the economic or technical lifetimes of some of these plants, which is of course tricky. But we need to do this because the rapidly decreasing financial competitiveness of coal, which we'll talk about, doesn't even take into account the dire externalized environmental or health costs. So it's a combination of this environmental imperative and health imperative. And then as you see on the next slide, please, also as we discovered, the economic imperative. So RMI, Carbon Tracker, and Sierra Club looked at, as I said, 2,500 coal plants around the world. This represents about 95% of the global operating coal fleet, including some under construction and planned coal capacity at the boiler level. We drew data from the Global Energy Monitor, the Global Coal Plant Tracker, Platts, and other national and regional sources. Our conclusions pertain primarily to 6 countries and regions: China, the European Union, India, the United States, a group of other developed countries, and a group of other developing countries. And some of the data is harder to scrub than others. So I'm going to be walking you through today the four of these regions. But first, let's look at the global results here. If we were to synthesize the main finding of the report, it is this: the economics of operating existing coal is deteriorating so quickly that it no longer makes sense to continue operating it in a lot of the world. The share of uncompetitive coal plants, meaning where it is more expensive to keep operating them, to replace them with new renewables and storage, is already at 39% of the global fleet in 2020, as you can see here. And that share will rise very quickly to 73% by 2025. If we can already save $39 billion by replacing the share of coal plants today that are uncompetitive, and by 2025, if you add up on a kind of global basis how much we can save by replacing the stuff that's not competitive versus the incremental cost of replacing what is competitive, as you can see, the world would save more than $100 billion. Again, this is not about the environmental impact. This has nothing to do with climate change. This is just purely on the financial analysis. And that is a very striking fact and an important piece of data for those who are working to replace coal with clean energy in a way that, that enables a just transition for workers and communities. Now, if we go to the next slide, please, I'm just going to do quickly the sort of key regional breakouts. This is the funky one for reasons I'll explain in a moment. So in the United States, 79% of the remaining fleet is uncompetitive in 2020. We project this will actually fall to 26% by 2025, but, and this is important, that's because of the phase down of the currently planned expiration of federal tax credits for wind, solar, and storage. If those tax credits were to continue, the number would grow from 79% to 99% by 2025. So, but even today, immediate replacement of uncompetitive coal with renewables plus storage would save the United States $10 billion per year. And one challenge to phasing out US coal is that the investor-owned utilities, which own the largest portion of the remaining fleet, face barriers to clean energy investments. For example, whereas third-party developers can take advantage of tax credits, tax benefits in year one, all tax benefits, investor-owned utilities must spread this incentive over several years. So there are barriers to phasing out the remaining coal fleet in the United States, but policy solutions do exist to address these problems. States can pass workarounds to allow utilities to profitably invest in solar and renewables. At the federal level, the ITC, investment tax credit rules, could be changed to remove the barrier, and there's a variety of legislative actions that are being considered now as the expiration of these tax credits comes up. But as you can see, it's a pretty big fork in the road, and the US is a good illustration of how important policy leadership continues to be, even as the cost curve for renewable energy continues to plummet. Next slide, please. So moving to the European Union, 50 gigawatts of European coal still has no closing date, and retirement policies vary widely by country. Coal retirement in some regions of the EU faces political opposition, as many of you know, due to fears of an insufficiently supported just transition for workers and communities, and due to the overall governance of the energy sector. However, as Thomas has mentioned, the EU is taking very strong steps in this direction. The EU's Just Transition Fund, which is aimed at supporting communities affected by coal retirements, can play a central role in phase out. But as you can see overall, according to our analysis, 81% of the 140 gigawatt remaining coal fleet is uncompetitive in 2020 already, and that will rise to basically 100% by 2025. And so immediate replacement of uncompetitive coal plants with renewables plus storage would save the EU $10 billion this year and $21 billion in 2025. Next slide, please. Moving to China, home to half of the world's coal capacity. And China has, of course, relied on coal to meet its growing power demand in recent decades, but China also increased renewable energy investment 100 times between 2005 and 2018, and accounts for a third of the world's renewable energy investments in 2018, showing what's possible and opening doors for even more large-scale renewables investment that can replace its uncompetitive coal fleet, especially in light of recently announced updates to its global goals under the Paris Agreement. As you can see, according to our analysis, 43% of China's coal fleet is uncompetitive already in 2020, and that will rise to 94% in 2025, which means that China could save $18 billion net in 2020 and almost $100 billion in 2025. Finally, India. Next slide, please. So India has set aggressive targets for renewable energy deployment, aiming to increase clean energy output from 86 gigawatts in 2019 to 450 gigawatts in 2030. The government's already identified 23 gigawatts of obsolete coal plants to retire by 2022 and an additional 26 gigawatts by 2027. According to our analysis, 17% of the 283 gigawatt coal fleet is uncompetitive in 2020, rising to 85% by 2025. And we'll talk in a couple minutes about why 2025 is not so very far away if you're in the business of planning the power grids and power generation. So now, next slide, please. So the problem, as Thomas already gave away the punchline here, is that all of this rosy news on the changing economics of coal does not automatically translate into a pace of retirement. It does so faster in liberalized power markets, but 93% of global coal plants are isolated or shielded from market competition with cheaper and cleaner renewables by long-term contracts. So customers are often locked into paying for expensive and dirty coal-fired power for years into the future, with little to no options to change their electricity source, and often very limited incentives for utilities to do so. Next slide, please. So how can it be done? Well, obviously there's been a range of strategies deployed around the world to accelerate retirement. Some of those are legal strategies, campaign-based strategies, and of course there's pressure on governments, I'm sure, in the PPCA and beyond, to mandate closure. But of course, while closing coal plants is undeniably good for the global and local environment, it's not necessarily good for local workers or local economic communities. And that's why the coal phase-out agenda is not just about doing away with something. It has to be about building something in its place, a transition. And so it helps if our toolkit to accelerate this process doesn't just rely on legal mandates and the inevitably fight to the death style argument about whether coal plants should be banned or not. And that's what we present in this paper, is a different agenda that's based around incentives. So we believe that governments and public finance institutions can take the lead. They're not the only ones that matter, but they can take the lead in accelerating coal phase out by taking a three-pronged approach. The first step is to refinance an existing operating coal plant, and I'll talk about one example of that on the next slide. The second is to reinvest in clean energy. The utility can use the proceeds from refinancing to build out renewable energy with storage, effectively replacing dirty financial returns with clean financial returns. And the third and final step is to set aside enough transition financing from the proceeds of refinancing to assist workers and communities affected by coal closures. Again, these are incentive-based and voluntary programs. And as such, they can bring stakeholders together in a less confrontational way and help them find common ground. Next slide, please. So one example, which I'm sure will be super easy to understand from this diagram, is ratepayer-backed securitization. So I'm going to be brief here, but happy to follow up offline, and you can read more about it in the report. So in a business as usual scenario, ratepayers are often locked into long-term costly contracts to purchase coal-generated electricity that they cannot get out of. That's illustrated on the left. And coal investors thus continue receiving their returns as promised in their contracts when the coal plant was built. Ratepayer-backed securitization gives an opportunity to escape this cycle and replace dirty and uncompetitive coal generation with clean energy without anyone losing value. It does so by allowing ratepayers, the customers paying for power, to directly raise low-cost debt for the refinancing of the coal plant on the basis of a pledge of the future revenues from a dedicated surcharge on their bills. So let's do a step-by-step process here. On the right, so the government passes enabling legislation, which creates a vehicle, a special purpose vehicle that can issue the bond that would refinance the coal asset and conduct the transaction. After the bond is issued through that special purpose vehicle, bond investors who purchase it are effectively immediately repaying the remaining undepreciated coal asset value back to investors, whether those are utilities, private investors, or other. The bond investors then are repaid over time through a surcharge on ratepayers' bills. However, important, ratepayers, even with the surcharge, like ordinary customers, are still paying less for electricity than they would have paid for an uncompetitive coal asset, thus creating a win-win situation. In summary, rather than waiting decades that we don't have for coal contracts to expire and their investors to be made whole, we can significantly accelerate the process by using an innovative financial tool that not only avoids the stranding of coal assets, but also reduces ratepayers' electricity bills. Bingo. Next slide. Almost done here. So if you want an interesting example, take a look at New Mexico, the state of New Mexico in green with the arrow here. Lovely place to visit as well, and conveniently close to Colorado. Now, so in New Mexico, New Mexico's Energy Transition Act, passed in 2019, uses securitization to turn the remaining value in non-competitive tariffs into an engine for transition. It authorizes the use of securitization to finance utility cost recovery for the retirement of the San Juan generating station. So it follows this three-part approach that I've described. It refinances they issued a $361 million order to replace about 500 megawatts of coal with a gigawatt of renewables plus storage. It allows utilities to acquire replacement resources through competitive procurement, with attention to locating these new renewable resources in areas impacted by plant retirement to aid the transition of local jobs and economic development. And it finances the transition for those communities, because retirement and replacement will save utility customers there $7 a month on average. And this act that I described reserves $60 million for community transition and $1 billion for renewables investment in affected counties specifically. This approach continues to spread in the United States. It's been passed in 3 states, New Mexico, Montana, and Colorado, introduced in 5, and on the radar in 10 more, as shown in this slide. So finally, next slide, please. And I will conclude here. Who should lead the charge? So the final section of our report asks that question: who can put this proposal into action? And first and foremost, we encourage governments and public finance institutions, green banks, multilateral and national development banks, and development finance institutions, DFIs, to consider what they can do in their regional and national context given the circumstances, right? Because the circumstances vary by region. This is not some giant cookie cutter global program that, you know, the World Bank can implement in every country. These institutions, public finance institutions, played a leadership role in ending public finance for new coal in the last 10 years. In the next 10 years, we believe, they have most of the mandates, the capital, and the expertise they need to create programs to deploy these innovative financial tools and help countries capture the economic opportunity of transitioning away from coal. However, obviously no single actor can do this on their own. And that's why collaboration among policymakers, public finance institutions, utilities, advocates, and communities is critical to achieving the best outcome. I will say that you can tell from the earlier slides that there are circumstances where subsidies will be required to achieve the early retirement of the fleet. In many places, they are not required because you can save money, as the examples I just gave illustrate. But the subsidies that are needed are only needed in the very near term because of the quickly changing economics. This is true, even though the results vary by region, this is pretty much true across the world. And that's why the impetus can come from public finance institutions and the governments that are their shareholders. We'll be hearing from Mafalda about the CIFs, the Climate Investment Funds, which have already started to do great work in this area. Another forum I would highlight that's coming up soon is the Finance in Common Summit, hosted by France and the International Development Finance Club in November, which brings together just this community of actors. So with that, I will end. Next slide, please. Thank you so much for listening. I hope that this has been interesting for you, and I'm happy to answer questions later and also offline. Back to you, Bini.
Thank you, Paul. That was an extremely rich presentation. Thanks for the overview of the financial tools and a really specific example of how this is being implemented. We've already got some questions popping in. For those of you who joined late, I just want to encourage you also to enter your questions into the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen. We also welcome any challenges or opportunities that you're seeing in your current work that's related to this that our panelists might be able to answer. So Paul, to help us reflect on your presentation, we actually have 2 interventions lined up here from Mafalda Duarte and Gravier Stein. So I'll first welcome to the screen Mafalda Duarte, who is the CEO of Climate Investment Funds, to speak to the global context for transition financing. Mafalda, over to you.
Thank you, Bino, and thank you very much to the organizers, to Francis, to UK government, Canadian government, Danish government, for having done such a great work with the Powering Past Coal Alliance. It's a pleasure to be here with you today. We have, over the past 1 year, we have been financing energy transition in developing countries for more than a decade, but we hadn't yet focused on accelerating coal transition. But this is now an area that we plan to prioritize and focus quite a bit alongside with the Just Transition agenda, which is quite interlinked with this accelerating coal transition as well. Paul said a number of things which are sort of like the arguments for us to focus on this agenda, and bear in mind that our work is in developing countries. Even when he showed, US and EU, there was a clear difference. Forget about the US in 2020 and 2025, but there was a big difference between developed countries and developing countries in terms of when are these plants going to become uncompetitive, the majority of them. And so for that reason, because there will still be, in the short term, as Paul also said, a sizable share of plants that are economic and that therefore will incentivize the owners to run them through their life cycle. And because of other dimensions, which I'll touch on briefly, I think there is a very big case for public institutions, public financial institutions, multilateral development banks, ourselves and others to provide support in the short term to developing countries. And I think, these energy transitions, as we've looked into this, what is quite critical is to understand that these transitions are quite unique. They will change from region to region, from context to context. And they span quite a complex array of issues that are not just the asset-specific issues, but they have to do with, institutional capabilities, the government side of this, the community side, the social impact side. And also, it is important to understand that the interventions need to be sustained for years. This is not a one-time off proposition. It's also important to understand that the impacts from decommissioning thermal power plants and coal mines, they extend quite beyond the immediate workforce, and they impact surrounding communities and along value chains that might be at a great distance from where these coal-fired power plants are. And so there are very significant social issues that are at the core of success in this agenda. Just to name a few, normally these regions are quite geographically isolated, and this can mean, when they are phased out, the loss of main regional employers and dramatic reduction of overall re-employment potential. These are normally regions with very narrow economic base. Another interesting fact is that the disparity of wages between, the coal mining and alternative professions is a deterrent as well. The identity that people have in these regions, and as I said, indirect job losses from subsidiary businesses, and these are complex transitions because one has to look at pre-closure, closure, and regional transitions, and one has to look at government, people and communities, and the land. What do we do with the land, and how do we repurpose the land so we can basically support a diversification, and it could be, renewable energy diversification through new renewable energy power generation, but it could be other activities as well. So I think Binu was telling me I have 1 minute. So what I want to say is that, you know, I agree fundamentally with Paul that that there is a very strong case for public institutions and the multilateral development banks and financial institutions like yourselves to play a very significant role in the short term, because, you know, we can basically work with governments in taking these long-term strategic approaches, which are very important. We have the capability of bringing different financiers together, of innovating, and we can bring to bear also, you know, significant institutional capability. I mean, the multilateral development banks, as we know, they operate across sectors, so energy, human development, you know, environment, and so they are quite well placed in my view. And this is also why we are taking a keen interest in really supporting programmatic integrated approaches into these regions, and making a big difference. So I'm gonna stop here, and then I can add a few things more in the Q&A. Thank you, Binu.
Great. Thank you so much, Mafalda, for giving us that larger context and encouraging us to think more long-term and in a larger way, looking at supporting developing countries. I want to also invite Dr. Grevier Stein from South Africa to give us some perspective from the work he's doing on the ground, working with ESCOM and impacted communities. Dr. Stein.
Thank you very much, Binu, and also thanks a lot to PPCA for inviting me to this important opportunity to talk to you. Yes, so I would, it's actually a good opportunity to talk about the South African case as an example of some of the opportunities that there are as outlined in the Rocky Mountain Institute's report about how we could approach accelerating the coal closures. So a quick bit of background first. South Africa is a developing economy, as you know. Although our per capita income is not unreasonable, we are one of the most unequal societies in the world. And now, particularly in the post-COVID era, we've got about, on the broader definition, we have about 43% unemployment. So we have an enormous social problem on our hands. Added to that, we are extremely carbon-intensive economy. We are about the 13th largest CO2 emitter in absolute terms in the world, and about the 12th largest in per capita terms. The World Economic Forum's Energy Transition Index ranks us as about 106th on the 115 countries that they rank. So we're not in a good position to engage in the transition. Our power sector is dominated by the state-owned entity, ESCOM, which generates approximately 86% of its electricity from coal power. We also, some of you might not know this, we also manufacture some of our liquid fuels from coal, which is a very highly carbon-intensive process. All of this has very important implications for the political economy of the energy transition, and that's perhaps one of the important points that I want to make today. We have 100 years of coal-based, energy-intensive economic development behind us, and the whole economy is shaped on low-cost coal-based power. And importantly, in the post-apartheid era, coal mining was actually one of the new and important opportunities for Black South Africans to enter the formal economy. So that's part of the challenge that we have to deal with in accelerating our transition. Our power utility, ESCOM, now faces a perfect storm. It's still in the process of finishing the construction of 2 of the top 10 largest coal-fired power stations in the world, which has now suffered from major time and cost overruns. And as a result, the economy is suffering from irregular blackouts, and we still have relatively low tariffs despite huge tariff increases in recent years. And as a result of that, ESCOM now has an enormous amount of stranded debt, approximately $15 billion US. So, so that's part of the challenges with the legacy system. On the other hand, we have actually in recent years run a highly successful renewables program, and renewables are now financially viable. So we don't really need green finance or subsidies to make renewables work. We have a fantastic renewables resource. However, the renewables program has been stalled due to essentially the political influence of the coal interests. And now with the new administration under President Ramaphosa, it's slowly starting again, but we still face huge challenges here. Recent modeling that we've done and is available on our website shows that because of the low cost of renewables and the fantastic resource that we have, South Africa can actually save at least an additional 1.5 gigatons of CO2 in the next 30 years over and above the current policy trajectory. So there's an enormous opportunity here. However, we suffer from path dependence. So I think I want to point out, as Mafalda also said, is that financial factors are very important, but it's not the only factor. So it's not as if the system is going to pivot simply because it's now becoming cheaper to build and run renewable plants. There's a huge institutional and political dependencies that we'll have to deal with. And I think this is also where finance can play an important role. So on the one hand, of course, there is green finance. And on the other extreme, there's the important role of the divestment movement. But increasingly, we are working on developing opportunities for transition finance, which not only has to support, in a sense, our legacy system while we commit to accelerating our transition, but it's also necessary to help us overcome this path dependence. And that is because there are, of course, winners and losers in this transition. So although it makes economic sense, there are still interest groups that are going to lose out. And we need to be addressing those, both the investors in coal plants, workers in communities that we've all heard already, etc. So the post-COVID, and this is my last point, the post-COVID crisis, and it's indeed a crisis in our economy as it is in many countries around the world, actually creates an important opportunity for international climate funders to offer concessional finance in return for accelerated mitigation in our power system. And we can talk more about that. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Gravier. Okay, to keep this flowing, I'll invite all three panelists on screen. So Paul Bodnar, Gravier Stein, and Mafalda Duarte. I think everyone should be able to see your beautiful faces. So I want to, we've got about only a few minutes to wrap up here. Maybe we'll combine some of the questions we're getting into 2 questions, 1 minute each, folks, for each of these questions. The first one is about the price tag. So this is one of the critiques we hear about financing coal phase out. Why should public money go to coal plant operators? Paul, I believe you had put a price tag of $361 million for New Mexico. Shouldn't the polluter pays principle apply? And a corollary to that question is then how do we ensure these financial solutions that ultimately benefit the workers and communities and support just transition? So maybe Paul, I'll let you start, and then Gravier and Mafalda.
Yeah, so I think, thank you for the question. The New Mexico example is one where everybody saves money by doing this. So the price tag is negative. And the negative price tag phenomenon is, one of the striking, we were surprised at the fact that in 39% of cases in the world, the price tag is already negative, and that will grow to 3/4 within 5 years. It takes a long time to negotiate and implement changes to the power system. So although 2025 seems far away, it's actually not far away at all. And if you look at some of the negotiated deals that have been struck in various places to retire or phase out coal plants early, some of those dates are, it's not like the day that it's signed, the coal plant shuts down. It's scheduled for 2025 or even 2030. And that is a victory in many ways. Look at what Alberta did in Canada, for example.
Mhm.
The fast changing economics mean that even where there's a price tag today that needs to be filled, if you want to do it today, you're actually not going to be doing it until a few years from now,
Mhm.
as you finished all the negotiations. But I will say one more thing, which is that, you know, there are places, if you want to do it quickly and you'd want to do it right now, where subsidy will come into play. And I know that, and I'm very sympathetic to people who feel that might even be, in some people's view, distasteful, right? Because it feels like the opposite of the polluter pays principle. But I guess what I would ask is this: if we are willing to spend taxpayer money on what we call climate finance, which is to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, if we feel it's an appropriate use of public money to help other nations reduce their greenhouse gas emissions or avoid greenhouse gas emissions, then we should be willing to think of that as more than just building new wind farms. It has to include carbon retirement, because carbon retirement is what reduces emissions directly.
Great. Thanks, Paul. Gravier, maybe more on the just transition side too. Mm-hmm.
Yes, Bina, yes. Perhaps also just on the financial side and why one should pay sometimes in some circumstances. I think the situation in South Africa is probably not uncommon, and probably applies to a number of other developing countries. And that is that our electricity tariffs are not necessarily cost reflective, right? So we're in a situation where, in effect, coal power has been hugely subsidized. And that means that there's a difference between the costs of generating power and the tariffs at which the economy is used to buying the power. So that gives us an additional challenge. So if our tariffs were cost reflective, it probably would have been possible to simply take the New Mexico example and slot it into our situation, because everything would have worked. But now we have this additional problem that our entire economy is based on essentially subsidized electricity. So we are in effect going to have to increase tariffs while we accelerate the transition. And I'm sure that's true in many other cases. And that creates an extra challenge for selling this to our politicians and policymakers. And I think it's particularly in this situation where concessional international climate finance could help and help crowd in other low cost finance. So let me leave that on that point. And of course, because of the dominance of coal power and coal energy in our economy, the social impact of an accelerated transition is huge. And given the high levels of inequality of income and wealth in our society, it's a severe challenge. And we will have to spend a significant amounts on social protection and creating new opportunities, developing new industrial policies, crowding in green economy in the coal areas, etc. And yeah, that will have to be part of that package. Thanks.
Great, thank you, Gravier. Mafalda.
Yeah, Paul and Grove said, you know, I think the key points. I mean, here we have to ask ourselves, are we not dealing with a global public good? Are we not dealing with an issue that we have to collectively resolve within a very short period of time? So we really need to come collectively and really not just think about new generation, renewable energy generation, but recognize, which I think, you know, it is a challenge for the environmental community and for the climate community, because we face these debates ourselves. Why should this capital be allocated for, you know, the coal industry? You know, here, you know, and these are the arguments, is that, you know, we have to reach these tipping points where, you know, basically building a new renewable energy power plant is cheaper than operating a coal-fired power plant. And, you know, and we have to do it in such a way that is just, because if it's not just, if there isn't a very, at the core of all of this, a just transition component, this will derail the reform. And in fact, you know, we have seen it already in cases like South Africa. So we need to have these integrated approaches to investing in coal transition, that basically we have to think about employment transition, diversifying the local economies, safeguarding, you know, having social protection programs in place, and, you know, and making sure that, you know, we are bringing the whole array of stakeholders into this process, into this reform process. And so I think, there is a very strong case. I mean, in any case, we keep subsidizing, which is another big call from international leaders to phase out fossil fuel subsidies. We continue today still subsidize fossil fuels. So I think the case is very strong to really support this transition with public resources, well allocated, of course.
Yeah. Amazing. Thank you, folks. I'm actually taking notes here. These are also going to be helpful for me moving forward. A couple of notes here. We are getting some really excellent questions here, and this discussion has been really rich. So I would like to suggest that perhaps we go a few minutes over so we can close properly. I do want to give some final remarks to the panelists here. Those of you who do have to go to another meeting, perhaps you can watch the webinar online later for the last 5 minutes. I want to round this round of questions off with a few questions we're getting here around actions that different actors can take, MDBs, or even someone like CIF. So I was wondering across the panel here, maybe if you can pick one actor each. We've got multi-development banks, utilities, governments, public finance sector. What actions and signals do you want to see from them, particularly in the coming year leading up to COP26? To support some of the solutions we've been talking about. Maybe we'll do the same order again. Paul, I'll let you go first.
Well, first of all, I would say that the debate about coal has been largely adversarial in many ways. And I think that what I would say in general is that we need to move into a less adversarial mode. We need to, where the different actors that have a stake in the outcome need to understand that other actors have legitimate views, and we need to try to work together to make this transition. And again, the economics are the kind of golden key that unlocks that possibility, because we're not arguing about just the environment, just the global environment, where we have the ability to structure real solutions that will save people money today. But that requires a little bit of a different mindset than sometimes we've had about this issue. And so that's just a general point. I think obviously we've pointed out that if only we had a global network of public development banks that had expertise in industrial transition, expertise in social issues, balance sheets, if only we had a global fund based around the world, the MDB system that could accept concessional financing and blend it with MDB finance. Wait, we do have such a system. So I think we have the system. We just need to start getting people thinking about what they can do to advance this agenda. And I'm sure Mafalda's unit can play a really important role.
Okay, maybe then I'll toss the ball over to Mafalda to follow up that comment from Paul.
I mean, this just builds on, what I agree fully with Paul. I think we have to maximize the value that existing institutions can bring to bear here. And for sure, the multilateral development banks have that possibility of operating at the policy level, and operating across sectors at the multiple level of government with private sector and also, across sectors. And what mechanisms like us intend to do is to support them in basically supporting these transitions in developing countries. So provide them with the incentives that they themselves require to embark on this transition. So we as I said, we are looking at this area with great interest and very keen on establishing a dedicated investment program for accelerating coal transition and generate the types of impact that we have generated in terms of renewable energy generation penetration in developing countries over more than a decade, but now doing it for this particular agenda, accelerating coal transition. So we are very much looking forward to working with the champions, and there are quite a few.
Yeah, for sure. So maybe that brings me to Xavier. Can you give us some insights? Yeah, from South Africa's perspective, what would be some of your requests? for signals.
Yes, thank you. Yes, in our work here and from our engagement with the multilateral development banks and other development finance institutions, I think there are two main points I can make. The first is, these financing strategies to help us accelerate shutting down coal plants, it doesn't really make sense to think of it as financing coal, right? Because we're not financing new coal. These plants they're already built. What we're actually trying to stop the burning of coal, right? So what you're really doing is you're supporting ratepayers and taxpayers to accelerate the shutdown of coal. It's not about funding coal. The plant's already built. So that's, I would say, is the first point. Second point is that from the work that we've done here, and I'm sure this is true in other jurisdictions, this is extremely good value for money. So even if there is some level of concessionality or subsidization involved, if you work it out in the net cost in dollars per ton level, it's extremely cheap from a development finance point of view. And so you can have huge impact for relatively low net cost. And the third point I'd like to make is that although many of the development finance institutions, multilateral development banks have adopted, climate policies and they don't fund coal anymore, etc., they still very much operate within the green finance paradigm. So they want to finance green infrastructure. They haven't really woken up to the fact, and their policies don't yet accommodate the opportunities that there are for transition finance, the kind of financing we're talking about here today. So that would be, and that might mean that you are ending up financing at the entity level, you are financing an ESCOM. So you're financing a coal entity, but you're financing in the context of a commitment to an accelerated decarbonization. So the policies will need to be revisited and adapted to help us exploit this important opportunity. Thank you.
Amazing. Thanks, folks. I feel like we could go on for the rest of the day here, but I'm going to have to call it to close here. If we saw a bunch of technical questions come up in the Q&A too. So Paul, if you don't mind, we'll request those folks direct those questions to Rocky Mountain Institute. They have a lot to do with the specifics of the report. But overall, thank you panelists again for spending some time with us and sharing your insights. And giving us a lot to think about in terms of elements to include in transition financing and supporting interventions in this field. It clearly sounds like there's a lot of upcoming work and perhaps a lot to be gained from sharing lessons as we all go ahead with our interventions. So with that, I want to turn it over to Mr. Ed Webber, who is the Deputy Director for International Climate Action at the UK government. The UK is also a co-lead for the PPCA. And Ed, I will let you close this session out. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you, Benu. And wow, what a pleasure it is to be able to conclude today's webinar. I hope you've all enjoyed it as much as I have. I just want to start off by saying a big thank you to the PPCA Secretariat for organising today, to the Rocky Mountain Institute for their fascinating How to Retire Early report, and to our formidable lineup of speakers and panelists, to Francis from the Canadian government, to Thomas Anker from the Danish government, Paul Bodner from the Rocky Mountain Institute, Mafalda Duarte from Climate Investment Funds, and Dr. Gravier Stein from Meridian Economics. I'm not going to be able to do justice to our speakers by trying to summarize everything we've heard today, but I would like to try and draw out a few of the themes we've heard, and then to link this back into the UK government's plans for its COP presidency next November in Glasgow. So firstly, I think we heard loudly and clearly today that the economic case for building new coal over clean energy is essentially over. But perhaps even more strikingly, over the coming few years, it's likely to become cheaper to replace the vast majority of the world's existing coal plants with new clean energy sources than to continue operating them. Secondly, despite these economic tailwinds, we need to move much further and much faster than we currently are, especially in dealing with the legacy of around 2,000 gigawatts of installed coal power capacity globally. And that means retiring a large coal plant every week for the next 30 years. And according to the IEA, we need the transition to clean energy to take place around 4 times faster than it is today to meet our Paris goals. So the global coal power fell by 8% in the first half of this year, but we need this rate of decline to increase and then be sustained year on year to 2030 to stay on track with Paris. Thirdly, and perhaps most importantly, we heard that to do this, we must bring people with us. That means finding ways to align the interests of all the key players involved in transitioning away from existing coal power: customers, governments, investors, owners, and most importantly, the workers and communities directly involved. Fourthly, innovative financial approaches like the ones we've heard about today are key for aligning the incentives of these different actors, saving customers money, reducing climate and health impacts on society, helping investors and owners reinvest their capital in clean resources, and ensuring workers and communities can achieve a just transition so they can thrive. And finally, we heard clearly that governments and public finance institutions have a key role to play here, including through programs like the proposed new accelerating coal transition window under the climate investment funds. And so this brings me to the role of COP26. COP26 provides a unique opportunity to accelerate clean energy deployment on the road to Glasgow. Alongside overseeing, hopefully, successful negotiations and encouraging countries to up their ambition in terms of NDCs, the UK has chosen several priority themes, including setting up a COP26 energy transition campaign. Under this energy transition campaign, we have 4 key outcomes we want to achieve. The first, working with our Canadian co-leads and fellow PPCA members, we are seeking to increase the number of countries committed to accelerating the phase-out of coal power. Meeting our Paris goals requires ending unabated coal power in developed countries by 2030, in other major emitters by 2040, and in developing countries by 2050. Secondly, we are committed to using our engagement with other governments and with the private sector to push for an accelerated end to the international financing of new coal plants. Third, we are seeking to work with other key donor and recipient countries to strengthen the clean energy offer available to them. This includes, for example, emerging economies with rapidly growing energy needs like Vietnam, who have signaled they plan to review half of their coal pipeline, as well as countries like Kenya, who have the chance to leapfrog coal in their development entirely. And finally, we are looking to establish a new framework for financial and technical assistance to support countries with strong existing dependence on coal power and mining in making a stable and just transition, including in countries like South Africa, where the UK has just announced a £3 million project through ESMAP, looking to repurpose retiring coal plants with Eskom. To drive forward these efforts, particularly the last two, the UK recently announced that it will establish a new COP26 Energy Transition Council to accelerate the transition from coal to clean power. The Energy Transition Council will bring together leaders of the global power sector, including the International Energy Agency, International Renewable Energy Agency, and multilateral development banks, along with governments, business, and civil society. The Council will work to ensure that every country considering new power generation, that clean power is the most attractive option available to them. And we will strengthen our collective support through development assistance, climate finance, and the sharing of expertise to help the most coal-dependent communities achieve a just transition. We will be inviting a number of key target donor countries and participant countries to participate in the Council towards the end of the year, followed by high-level regional and thematic dialogues next year. And we're confident this will provide a powerful mechanism to drive the change we need to see, which has been outlined by so many of the speakers today. So with that, I want to thank all of our speakers again, my PPCA colleagues, and all of you for attending. Please do send through your feedback on how today went and your ideas for future topics and speakers, and I look forward to seeing you next time. Thanks and goodbye.